Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is Dan Hornacek with Leading on the Frontlines podcast. This is going to be a little different than the actual podcast posted because, once again, my video failed the last time. So, just like it did before, we changed kind of how I'm going to be doing this. I'm using a different media recorder. So, this is going to be more of a summary, basically, on what I went over in the podcast. So, it's going to be a little shorter. I do plan on in the future utilizing this method, so we shouldn't have this problem in the future. So excited for that. So again, this is episode 3. It's about servitude and serving your employees. It's going to be a continuation on last week's podcast of taking ownership of it being my fault on if my team does well or does bad. So just to kind of recap that really quick on the concept, the last week's podcast and video was about taking ownership as the leader or as the manager within your organization and with your team, and basically having the self-realization that if they do good or if they do bad, it's ultimately your fault as the manager on how they do this, or excuse me, how they perform. So, which is a good and a bad thing, because you can look at it from the perspective of you're able to recognize what needs to be fixed, but you're also able to um, praise when praise is needed. And so this kind of goes hand in hand with today's episode, because it goes along the line, goes along the same vein as servitude. You want to serve your employees, and doing this will really allow you to be a better and more empathetic manager. So there's a big difference between empathizing and sympathizing with your employees. You want to understand where they're coming from. You want to listen to them and hear them, but you don't necessarily want to feel sorry for your employee. So, or even your peers too, because I think you can have an effect on other leaders and whatnot within your organization. So that's kind of a key piece here. So when we're serving people, we want to empathize and not sympathize. And I think utilizing the mindset again of it being our fault, you're able to serve better. And what I mean by that is, and I use kind of a positive and a negative, right? So the positive being, for one, to kind of go back on the self-reflection, you should be observing, your team, whether that be from, an operation where you're watching them work, you're watching productivity, you're watching, throughput, you're watching just the processes of things getting done, and kind of going from, are these people trained correctly? Does it seem like they're having a bad day? Things like that. And seeing someone performing at either a higher level than they normally do, or seeing them just, a stagnant employee or somebody who doesn't necessarily perform as well as they normally do, now reaching a higher level. So to that point, praising in public, right? That's the key term, or the first saying that's out there, praise in public. That's serving your employee. And recognizing if they're more of like an introverted person where they might not want to be praised in public, at least pulling them aside and praising them in private also. I think it's very, very important to praise employees when they're doing a good job. I honestly, and this is a personal opinion, I truly believe that praising employees, at least nowadays, is more effective than, you know, criticizing or trying to teach them. And I don't mean that from like a bad place. I just think that, you know, you know, you attract more with honey, right? That kind of goes along those same lines. And I think that if you foster kind of a relationship based on the observance and the praise of good work, they're apt to give you more, right? People like that. I do. I mean, when people tell me I do a good job, that motivates me to continue to continue to do a good job. So on the flip side of that, right, in order to serve your employees in other ways, if we'll kind of look at this from two perspectives, right? Because you can have good employees, right, kind of doing worse, and then you can have just bad employees. And I can get flack for saying it's a bad employee, but let's be real. I mean, a bad employee is a bad employee. How can you turn them into a good employee? How can you, right, lead them into a direction of being a good employee? Because from like a turnover perspective, right, we don't want to lose people too, right? If we have someone who's currently doing the job, or at least somewhat understands kind of the processes and stuff, we wouldn't want to get rid of them necessarily, and bring someone else new, unless it's just a complete lost cause. But to that point, I mean, that's a very small percentage when we really look at from a turnover perspective. Again, that falls on our shoulders to set them up for success. So again, going back to let's talk about a good employee, right? How can you serve a good employee who might be falling behind, right? I think from a leader's perspective, you need to be cognizant of this happening as soon as possible, right? Is it something going on in their life? Is it that they're stagnant in their role? They've been doing it too long and they're just kind of, you know, over it. I mean, that's very possible. Um, is there something else going on? Are they interested in a different role and they just kind of are doing their everyday hoping that this conversation will happen? There could be a million different things, but I think observing those employees and looking at their metrics, seeing that maybe they're falling behind, and then having that conversation with them, that alone is serving them in a way that you care enough to observe what they're doing. In another way, to kind of tie into that, when you do have this conversation with them, again, you can't forget a good employee's record, right? They've been a good employee for however long. They've been performing well. Just because they might be faltering doesn't mean you have to have this like dead on, like, why are you doing this way? You are falling behind. You are failing. That's not a really good approach. If anything, it's going to cause that employee to, again, not want to improve, and that's the ultimate goal. So listening to the employee and hearing them, right? If they have critiques of you, right? They have critiques of other employees, of the operation. These are important things to listen to. It can be hard to hear at times, but it's important to listen to it. It's important to take what they're telling you, maybe make a note of it, and then reflect on it later and follow up with them. And that's the serving piece of it. I think a lot of times it's forgotten to follow up with employees after they air their grievances, if you will, especially ones that are good employees, or even mediocre employees, ones that are just doing their job, and you see them kind of like tailing off a little bit. And then again, if it's something about the working conditions, if it's conflict with another employee, if it's a managing style that maybe they just don't agree with you, these are all things that are pretty easily fixable for the most part, right? There's always going to be those weird situations where it might be more difficult, but hearing those, right? Following up with your employee that, this is the summary of what I'm hearing from you. This is what you need from me. And then tell them your plan, right? This is what I'm going to do to try to make this better for you. And that goes a long way. But the most important piece of it is once you do that, you actually have to follow through and do it. But a key piece of that also, though, is if you can't, right? If there's those situations, like I said, the small percentage where really nothing can be done, I think you need to communicate that to your employee. I think you need to sit there and tell them, like, look, this is why we can't do it either right now or just in general. And that's where the empathy comes in. I understand it's frustrating. I would feel the same way if I was in your position. What can we do? Like, this is where we are, so what can we do to relieve it in some way? And I think that's an important conversation. And typically, if they're a good employee, it's going to be fine, right? They'll be able to handle that conversation, I think, pretty well. When you have kind of like a mediocre to, what we would call a bad employee, I think that it's important to kind of course, you're going to be critical, right? It's going to be a constructive conversation that you're having, but you could learn a lot. This typically people don't go into a job hating it, right? Or they innately want to do a good job, and they might just not know what a good job is, right? So I think that, again, a lot of this is going to be kind of repetitive because listening, like aggressively listening, right? That's a leadership tactic that is used quite often. And what we do with aggressive listening is you're listening for like key concepts of where am I failing as a leader? Where's the operation failing? Is there, another employee that's kind of causing this rift? There's a lot of things that you could be doing as far as listening, or things that you could be listening for. And it's the hard part about it with these types of employees is that typically you don't want to listen to them. You're like, who are you, right, to say that this needs to be better when, Julie does 10 times better than you do. Well, they could be doing better maybe if we listen to them and are able to cater to some of those items. So the same as with the other employee, listening, right, reflecting on what they said. If it's feasible to make changes, come up with a plan, follow up with that employee saying, this is what I heard that you need from us. This is what I can do for you. Is that agreeable? Yes. Wonderful. This is where we're going to put it. This is when we're going to put these things in place, and then do it. And then for both of those situations, it's important to follow up after the fact. Like, hey, look, it's been a week, it's been a day, it's been a month, however, whatever works for your particular operation. But it's good to follow up after the fact. Like, hey, we've made these changes. How are things now? Hopefully, they will be grateful and things will be good and they'll be happier. And then you could be able to see that from their metrics, or just from their attitude, or from the work that's being turned in, however it might be working out for you. But having those conversations, be ready for them to be critical, right? Because you're opening the door. If you open that door and they're critical with you and you're just like, whoa, no, what do you mean we did all this for you? That's not how it works, because it's almost like you're canceling out what you've done before. You need to be open to that critical conversation with the employee. So again, really the servitude piece of this, right? It's not obvious. A lot of people think it's like this grand thing, like, oh, I'm going to buy them pizza, I'm serving my employees. That's not it at all. It's a self-serving concept, right? Because ultimately, whatever the office or your sales floor, or if it's an operation, if it's a job site like at a landscaping company, the ultimate goal, right, is to increase productivity or increase quality of work. So it is a selfish motive in a way, but at the same time, it's kind of a win-win, because if you do these things and your employees do feel heard, you're going to gain that respect from them. So again, it's not obvious what you're doing to serve them. The way you're serving them is by hearing them, by being empathetic to what they're talking about and their needs, and then also by following up and actually doing the things that you say they're going to do. So I mean, that's really the whole piece of like the servitude piece of this. I really recommend, if you haven't read it, there's a book called Hunter Servant Leadership. That's where this concept, where I got this concept at least, as I was coming into learning to lead different teams and things. This is when I was learning to be a sales manager with an emerging leaders program back when I worked for a commercial sales distributor. I went through this, and Hunter really puts into perspective kind of the whole service and serving your people. It's very important, I think. In my opinion, it's one of the most important concepts to leadership, and it is the one that pays out the most in dividends, just from my experience. So again, this is kind of the summary. I highly recommend you jump onto the podcast. We're on all the major platforms with Apple and whatnot. So check us out there. Please check us out on Instagram. I post daily, if not multiple times, and Twitter. The same handle, Leading on the Frontlines. So please check me out. Follow me, subscribe to the podcast, rate and review. I would love it to hear from you guys and see what you guys have to say. So feel free to comment on this YouTube video as well. And we'll go from there. So next week we'll have another podcast. I'm setting up a few interviews with some guys in leadership positions and a couple leadership consultants, which I'm really excited about. I'm hoping that I can maybe learn a few things too. So again, Dan Hornacek, Leading on the Front Lines. Hope to hear from you. Have a good day.